Intermittent fasting nowadays is very popular. It is very often described on popular blogs or on different commercial sites. But the question is if this kind of restrictions when it comes to food window, eating window, is it really associated with a better health, some kind of improvement in metabolic parameters, or for example with weight loss? If you are interested in this kind of information, please stay with me. First of all, as the name suggests, fasting restriction involve some kind of dietary restrictions. And in fact, speaking of caloric restrictions, which means eating fewer than we need in fact, but of course without causing malnutrition, is the most effective anti-cancer strategy. Caloric restriction causes some changes at the cell level. For example, the inhibition of the certain nuclear transcription factors, but also the inhibition of the release of inflammatory mediators. And it is worth to mention that caloric restriction is also one of the most effective anti-age methods. But when talking about caloric restriction in the context of anti-cancer effect, it is worth specifying that it is about a preventative effect, not a cure for a cancer. Because an excessive caloric restriction and also deficiencies in micro and micronutrients may lead to the development of malnutrition and even increase the mortality rate. So please be careful. But coming back to the intermittent fasting, it is not only about caloric deficit, it is also about eating in the particular time of the day. Does the intermittent fasting actually affect our metabolic health? Yes, it regulates, for example, the carbohydrate metabolism. And here a food window, so the time when we are eating during the day, but not during the night and not even during the evening, may be very useful. The highest insulin sensitivity is in the first part of the day. As the day progresses, the insulin sensitivity decreases and it is the lowest during the night. So this is not so good to eat during the night and also during the evenings. Therefore, meals eaten at night cause a greater increase in serum glucose and also hyperinsulinism. And as a consequence, it increases the risk of type 2 diabetes. Intermittent fasting may also help in reduction of the level of the triglycerides, and also intermittent fasting can facilitate the weight loss even in normal weight individuals. But also it is worth to mention that overnight fasting of 11 or more hours may affect positively the weight loss. Intermittent fasting reduces also the inflammatory markers and has an impact on our microbiota, but very positive impact, which means that it increases the diversity of the bacteria, but also decreases the permeability of the intestinal barrier. It is also worth to mention that it can improve our well-being, reduce the level of aggression, gives us also more vitality, and even improve our self-esteem. And when it comes to life expectancy, observational studies show, for example, that the Seventh-day Adventist who applies fasting, for example, extended night fast, they live on average 7 years longer in the comparison to the general population. But we should also remember that this is not only because of the fasting. For example, the Seventh-day Adventists, they also follow very good practice when it comes to body care. They also follow a very healthy diet, plant-based diet. They do exercise. They also not smoke. And this is a part of their faith. But on the whole, overnight fasting reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, or cancer, especially breast cancer. And what are the limitations of this method, intermittent fasting? So unfortunately, the data from the human studies are very limited. Mainly we have reports from the animal model studies. Unfortunately, the positive effects of the intermittent fasting are not always obtained. There exist some cases of the overweight or even obese people with some glycemic and also insulin abnormalities during one-day fasting. And when it comes to the comparison of the standard caloric restriction plans versus intermittent fasting method, for example, the method of 2 days of the restrictions, caloric restrictions, and 5 days with no restriction, so the weight loss and metabolic effects on intermittent fasting are not superior to those achieved by continuous caloric restriction. And longer restrictions, like fasting more than 12 hours involving skipping breakfast, does not produce clear results. There are some studies which show no effect on weight loss, glycemia, lipid profile, or inflammatory markers. And we should also be aware of some side effects of the intermittent fasting, like distraction, like lowered mood, or, for example, decreased performance at work. We should also be very careful when it comes to applying intermittent fasting for people, for example, with gastrointestinal disorders. Why? Because too large portions of the food during the eating window can disturb the symptoms from the gastrointestinal tract. We should be also very cautious when it comes to applying intermittent fasting for people who suffer from diabetes and are using insulin as a treatment. Also, it is very demanding to follow the intermittent fasting method when we are very physically active, or, for example, for people with very demanding work when it comes to physical activity, or, for example, mental demanding jobs. It is also very risky to recommend intermittent fasting method to people with a history of eating disorders, because the following such a very strict plan like an intermittent fasting method can even worsen the existing disorder. And when it comes to nutrition, it shouldn't be a fad, but rather a considerable and conscious living style. In addition to a food window, it is also worth following a generally hygienic lifestyle, including physical activity, a better sleep, and also mental hygiene. And also dietary experiments without making a conscious decisions to make a holistic change in the current diet result mostly in a yo-yo effect, which is even worse than a stable obesity. In conclusion, eating according to the diurnal rhythm, which means eating mainly during the day and fasting during the night, lowers the risk of diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and even cancers, especially breast cancer. And in fact, eating mainly in the first part of the day with a tendency to reduce calorie supply as the day progresses translates into better health and also lower body weight. Unfortunately, a short fasting during the night translates into higher glycated hemoglobin levels and also shorter sleep time. So, for example, having 12 hours of fasting, overnight fasting before, for example, laboratory test has an undeniable effect on the stabilization of the laboratory parameters like glucose, hormones, or triglycerides levels. We should also remember that we have different types of restrictions, for example, fasting a whole day, but also intermittent fasting can consist of, for example, 12 to 14 hours of the overnight fast. And during the introduction of the restriction, the self-observation is very important. For example, how it affects our well-being, and for example, the self-observation if such kind of restriction do not cause, for example, paroxysmal overeating, and for example, how it affects our mood. And it is also very important what we eat during the eating window. Why? Because, for example, if we combine our food products in this eating window, choosing only highly processed food, it won't translate into a better health. And let's remember that any rational diet is effective as long as it is accepted and mainly when it is applied. If you liked my video, please leave the thumbs up, and I hope that we will see each other in the next episode.